Hi, I'm Marion Kellner, and you're listening to Local Bias. We are recording from Greenfield Community Television Studios, and I'm here with my guest, Randy Kehler. So.
Hi, Marion.
Hi, Randy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank
you.
You.
So I invited you on because I know that your life is like a treasure trove of activities and connections to the history of this country over quite a number of decades. And so I understand, we'll start with one big point in history. And I understand it was on NPR recently, and that is your connection to Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War. So we're going back to what seems like ancient history, but is still very much alive. So I'm hoping that you can tell me and the listening audience about Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers, and what you were doing at the time and your connection.
Sure. Just to back up a bit, Dan Ellsberg at age 86 was being interviewed on NPR the other night, and all sorts of people called me and said, "Quick, turn it on, he's mentioned your name." So I turned it on and he mentioned my name again. And the reason he mentioned my name is that in 1969, I was giving a talk at an international conference of war resistors from around the world. And I had turned in my draft card. I refused to cooperate with the Vietnam draft, and I knew I'd be heading to prison soon. And I said that in the talk. And unbeknownst to me, this guy named Dan Ellsberg, who was a Marine, combat Marine officer who'd been in Vietnam, and he had been fighting in the trenches of Vietnam and worked for the Pentagon and the RAND Corporation and high up, all this stuff, that I didn't know he was listening. And when I said to everybody in the audience, and very soon I expect to be in prison because I won't cooperate with this war, he cracked up. Dan is besides a brilliant, brilliant person, he's a very emotional man, and he's a man with a huge heart.
So cracked up, what do you mean by cracked up?
He burst out crying.
Oh.
And he left the auditorium, and he says in his memoir that he went into the men's room and just collapsed and sobbed. And he said, because he'd been trying to think, what can I do to stop this war? I've been over there, I've seen we're not winning, I've seen the slaughter, and I don't want to be part of it. What can I do? I have been part of it. I don't feel good about being part of it. And he said, the question I'd never asked myself until I heard me speak was, what would I be willing to do or to risk if I, like Randy and other young men like him, were willing to go to prison for doing that?
Yeah, that's a question, a very important question for everybody to ask themselves.
Well, a lot of times we don't do what we think is the right thing to do because we're afraid of the consequences, and one consequence can be going to prison. And so soon after that, he publicly distributed copies of the secret history of the war that he had been part of writing, and distributed to the New York Times and the Washington Post and papers all over the country, making clear that we had been lied to by 4 successive presidents, Democrat and Republican, about the nature of the war, the fact that we were losing the war, the fact that it was an unwinnable war, and that we were essentially just in it to save face. Imagine.
Yeah.
And people went nuts, and it appeared everywhere, and Nixon's government tried to shut down the distribution of it, and the New York Times went ahead anyway, facing prison and possible prison for their officers themselves, and then the Washington Post did it. And there's then, a dozen papers around the country to whom he had given parts of these papers, all put it out. And historians say that it was instrumental in turning the tide to ending the war.
Yeah.
So
how do you feel about that?
well, one thing I've often said is when people say, oh, what's the point of doing that or taking that risk or so forth, what's it going to get you? It's not going to make any difference. It won't do any good. Who cares? Say, you never know who might be listening.
Yeah.
In my case, I didn't know Daniel Ellsberg, of all people, was listening and that he would do something.
Yeah.
So never feel like doing the right thing is futile. It's never futile. You just don't know what the repercussions will be.
Right. I think that's a really important thing to remember.
Yeah.
On every level and in any job, and whether it's something huge on the world stage or whether it's walking down the street and smiling at someone.
Right.
Because we're all connected.
Yeah.
And what any of us do at any time is going to have some effect.
That's right.
Though we don't know what.
Yeah, it's ridiculous to say that anything will have no effect. For one thing, how do you know? And for another thing, as you say, everything has some effect.
Yeah, it'd be impossible for it not to. So doing what feels right, would you say that's like a core moving principle in your life? What you feel is right?
I don't know whether I can talk about it as a principle as much as it's just something inside me that can't not do what I think is the right thing to do, no matter what the consequences. I can't live with myself if there's something that I think that I should do because it's the right thing to do, and that I can do. Now, maybe that's an exaggeration. Of course, there are all kinds of things that I could do that I'm not doing. But if it hits me personally, paying taxes for war, for example, knowing that the tax money will buy bombs that will kill, families and children and grandparents and destroy hospitals and homes and the environment, I reached a point back during the Vietnam War where I thought, not only can I not lend my body to the war machine, and that's what it is, a war machine, biggest, most gigantic war machine the world has ever known, but I also can't lend my money to support it either. Right. So,
and you were willing to take a very big risk, which resulted in the loss of your house.
That's right.
Which is something most people would not do. I mean, this is what I feel. I feel like there are so many situations that go on in the world, and you wonder, how could this have ever happened?
Yeah.
So even, let's say, slavery in the United States. But it could happen because people like me could say, this is wrong, but I'm not willing to take that really big step so that my life is dramatically impacted. So I'll pay my taxes because I want to keep my house.
Right, sure.
And then perpetuate something. So there's something sort of, extraordinary about being willing, okay, I'll go to prison, okay, I'll lose my house, in you and in your life.
It's hard to explain. All I can say is my conscience doesn't let me do certain things. And I'm not perfect, and I do a lot of things probably I shouldn't do, believe me, but there are certain places where I draw the line. I always remember that wonderful line, I think it was by, was it E.E. Cummings, who said, "There is some shit I will not eat." It's like,
is that a famous quote?
Where do you draw the line? Because
they'll have to bleep that out, maybe. I never heard that.
Yeah, so I feel that strongly, and I also feel that what allows horrible things to go on in this world is not so much the perpetrators of those horrible things. It's all of us who keep silent about it. Mm-hmm.
And collaborate.
And thus collaborate. I mean, not even actively collaborate. But silence is an active collaborator, especially when it's carried on by, multitudes of people.
Right.
So I just think I try to speak out about things that feel important to me, even though I have no evidence whatsoever to think it's going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. Because I cannot live with myself if I shut up about it.
Yeah,
And I know that sometimes it does make a difference.
that's right. Yeah, you've seen that.
I've seen that in my
Yeah.
life.
So on another level, as far as nurturing yourself, I know that there are a lot of people who get involved in politics and burn out, and strange things happen.
Yeah.
So there's the life force. You know, in some ways I feel like there's so many forces that are trying to squash everybody's life force and the
Yeah.
life force of the earth and
Yeah.
of everybody on it, that it is almost a daily effort to maintain a certain sense of enjoyment, equanimity, spiritual contemplation, and so forth. So I guess my question to you, knowing what you were just talking about, how do you replenish yourself, and where do you find joy in your life?
I find it in all kinds of places. I don't think people would regard me generally as a sort of depressed or morbid individual. You know, I find joy in little things. Right now in my life, my 2 little grandchildren, in my friends, and I find inspiration from people who, you know, oftentimes have been a lot more courageous than I've ever been, who speak out, who risk arrest, who go to prison for doing what is right, and I'm inspired by them, and so that keeps me going. And there is, you know, there is joy, I think, in doing what you think is right. It's not this grim kind of, all right, you know, it's, and especially when you find yourself surrounded by or in touch with, in some way, other people. I mean, there are people everywhere who speak so-called truth to power in little ways, you know, at work, in their neighborhoods, at school, or whatever, and in larger ways with regard to the government, for example, or whatever. And I think there's something fulfilling about that makes people who do that generally, in some way, feel good about themselves and even happy people. I don't know that I'm the happiest person in the world because I carry a lot of pain and sorrow about what's going on in the world, but I don't think anybody would describe me as a depressed person either.
No, I wouldn't.
So, you know, it just makes me, there are rewards about, I mean, one of the things I found out early in my life, maybe at the time I committed my first act of nonviolent civil disobedience, which was turning in my draft card and refusing to be drafted during the Vietnam War, was that you find yourself in touch with people that you never knew, who appreciate what you did, and it just opens up doors to some amazing people who may not do what you do, and it may not have and may not ever, but who can appreciate what you did, and you find out about them. And
Yeah.
so I feel I'm surrounded by a sea of people like that, all over here, locally, in this country, and even in other parts of the world.
Yeah. And just to clarify, I think, as far as I understand, when a person is or when you, as a tax resistor, don't pay taxes,
A war tax resistor.
War tax. You do something with that money.
Oh, always.
Right. So what do you do with it?
I've most of the time had a formula. Let me see if I can remember it. My memory is slipping these days. But I like to give a part of it to the victims of war. So if, for example, if we were dropping bombs on Iraqi people, I give it to organizations like the Red Cross or whoever it is that are actually helping the survivors of the bombs that we're dropping.
And you've given to veteran organizations?
I've given to a lot of veterans groups, U.S. veterans groups, as well as to organizations that help the victims overseas. So, and I like to give some locally to the things that I feel are most underfunded here, in part because of our huge military budget, which takes almost 50% of every, what they call discretionary tax dollar. That is to say, every tax dollar that our Congress has some choice in sending this way or that way, about 50% goes to something related to the military. And so
therefore, the social programs suffer. Right. And so you funnel some of that money to local underfunded programs.
Oh, I do. My wife Betsy and I have been doing that for, I would say, since the 70s. What, 50 years almost? Yeah, it's our practice. To me, it's a spiritual practice. I mean, it feels like for us the right thing to do, and we get such moving letters from groups, whether they be U.S. veterans groups or groups abroad who are underneath the bombs that we drop, or other people that it's very, very, very gratifying, even though it, of course, is a violation of the law, and there are consequences for that.
Yeah. I remember when they were trying to take your house because you hadn't paid the taxes, and people were doing civil disobedience, and there was one person who was being taken out of the house. I think, to humanize people who were caught in the system, like the people who were taking people out of the house.
Yeah.
For one, the woman said, my father had been an IRS man. Mm-hmm. He would be turning over in his grave if he saw what I was doing.
Yeah.
And the IRS man said, no, he would have been proud of you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then you were playing the piano. I remember hearing
Right.
a story. Do you want to tell that story?
Well, we got tipped off that they were, after we had started with holding and giving away our federal tax money. We always pay state tax money, always have, and local taxes, but the federal, 50% of which was going to something having to do with making war. So we got tipped off that they were going to seize our house. So we decided that, I said I'm not leaving. I stayed in, and we knew that we were tipped off that they would be coming the next morning, the federal marshals. So I stayed in the house, and I tried to calmly play the piano. They came in and arrested me. And maybe I'm not answering your question about why I got
I remember they
sidetracked.
wanted to, one person thought that you should stop playing and be arrested and
That's
taken
right.
out.
That's right.
But then there was another guy,
Yeah.
another marshal.
Well, what they do in situations like this is there's a local federal marshal, but they bring in ones from outside because they know that the local one might somehow be sympathetic. Although I had never met the local guy, but he was sympathetic. And he was still going to arrest me, but he comes up and he said, we need you to stop playing the piano. And I said, I'll stop when I finish the piece. And he said, okay. And meanwhile, these other guys who came in from, there were like, 6 or 8 of them, all armed to the teeth and standing around. They said, tell him to stop. And the local guy turned around and with great courage and strength said, he is finishing the piece. And so I finished, my fingers wiggling all over the keyboard. So
It's very moving.
Yeah.
Because there are good people who are in jobs that
Of course there are.
don't reverberate exactly with them.
Yeah, and I have nothing against even the guys who were a little bit brutal about it. And a film was made about this whole scene, which has actually won national awards. It's called
Act of Conscience.
That's right, Act of Conscience. Right, it's been.
You get to see Randy as a handsome young man.
Imagine that.
No, you're a handsome older man now. But that movie,
Yeah.
I have to say, is like a Shakespearean drama.
Huh, really?
It is like all of these huge issues played out on the stage,
Yeah.
you know, of authority and someone without authority,
Right.
of power, those with less power,
Right.
of community
Right.
and outsiders. I mean, there are just like so many themes
Right.
that it's just, I think the library, Greenfield Library,
Yeah.
has a copy, but it is
Yeah.
definitely worth
The
seeing.
film has won awards, and it's narrated by Martin Sheen, which probably helped it win an award.
Yeah.
But it's been aired on TV and private theaters in thousands of places.
Yeah.
But it's we were lucky in a way that our story was told widely. There are lots of courageous people doing courageous things and making sacrifices, whether it's losing their homes or going to prison or whatever, whose story is never told.
Right. The vast, vast majority,
Yeah, so
almost everybody.
We're grateful about that. And
Yeah.
anyway.
Would you say there's something in your upbringing that, you know, I've always curious about this because in my family, my father was, you know, sort of a lefty in a pretty conservative family.
Right.
And it's sort of like, why? I mean, how did that happen?
Yeah.
He was always that way.
Yeah.
And they were sort of always that way.
Yeah.
So what kind of a family did you grow up in? What kind of background?
Well, I came from a very privileged family in the upper middle class town of Scarsdale, New York. My father worked for a baking company, Arnold Baking. You
I
still
remember
buy
that.
Arnold bread, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was sort of a typical upbringing, and my parents certainly were not war resistors or conscientious objectors or people did civil disobedience. I mean, horror is to think. But, I had a fairly typical upbringing. But when I got into college, I went to Harvard. The Vietnam War was eating away at me. It really was. And so I signed a statement saying, that was going around through all the colleges, this is in the mid-'60s, saying, if called by the draft, I will not go. Public statement. And of course, you could risk many years in prison, and I did that with great trepidation. It was the first time I ever done anything like that. And in the end, I wasn't apprehended before I left for college. I was in college before I left for graduate school, but when I got to graduate school, I was indicted for draft resistance, and I was on the West Coast. I was a student at Stanford and dropped out and joined the War Resistors League, where I was surrounded by people who were very sympathetic, which was very helpful. It's very hard to do these things alone.
Yeah.
So I stood my ground, and they indicted me, and I went to prison I had a 2-year sentence, and I served almost all of it, which was one of the most actually educational experiences of my life. Really, in fact, I've often said I learned far more in 2 years of federal prison than I learned in 4 years at Harvard. And I mean it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Real life.
Real life. Yeah.
What would you say was one of the lessons you learned in prison?
One of the lessons was that people in prison are not bad people any more than the people who are not in prison. There are an awful lot of people walking around outside of prison who've broken all kinds of laws, especially people with money, and who can hire big lawyers and so forth. People in prison are often, in most cases, they're poor, they're desperate, and they did not have the kind of advantages I had growing up in a upper middle class white family. And so, you know, it was a tremendous educational experience for me. And I came away, you know, understanding a lot more about people who are not like me, who didn't grow up in Scarsdale, and who didn't have privileged education.
Yeah.
And
Sometimes the bigger the crime, the more chance you have of not going to prison, right? So the failure of the banks or declaring war and having millions of people killed.
Yeah.
No, people don't go to jail for that.
That's right.
Or to continue a war to save face
Yeah.
while everyone's being massacred.
But you can go to
But-
war for opposing those things.
For opposing those things, or for robbing a grocery store because
Yeah.
you don't have enough money for food.
That's right.
Something like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I've often said I learned far more. Now, start to get teary, but I learned far more in 2 years of prison, far more than I learned at 4 years of Harvard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really did.
Yeah. And I think the fact that you're capable of feeling to the degree that you feel has to figure in like this, you know. It's like, I was very moved when you were telling me about how you take the animals that were hit by cars off the road.
Right, right.
And it touches you deeply
Yeah.
too. And it's that feeling of deep compassion and identification with and the preciousness of life and all the rest that I always think people who are telling the news on TV, they should all be sobbing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody should be sobbing.
That's right. That's
yeah,
right.
but very few people do.
That's
And
right.
so we get used to being handed news of the most horrific in the most matter-of-fact tone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, if you let it in, and especially for a man, if you're not afraid to let the tears come, to really feel it, whether or not the tears come, just to really feel it inside, I think you do yourself damage to ignore that awareness and that feeling. And
Yeah.
I've always had, call it thin skin for those kinds of things. I feel things, and I feel like I have to do something about it if I can. And of course, so much of what goes on in the world, we can't do anything, or it seems like there's nothing we can do. But
Yeah.
sometimes I think even the smallest thing is worth doing. I haven't stopped any wars. I haven't, but I can influence other people, and maybe that's the best I can do.
Yes. Well, we've come to the end of our time at Local Bias, and it's been great talking with you. I hope you come back
Thank you.
in the future. We have a lot to talk about. And so you've been listening to Local Bias. I'm Marion Kellner. My guest has been Randy Kehler. Thanks for joining us, and I look forward to sharing more time with you in the future.